Okay, so this is the Bible study for Genesis chapter 26, and we're taking verses 1 through 11 for today. It says, Now there was a famine in the land, besides the previous famine in Abraham's time. And Isaac went to Abimelech, king of the Philistines, in Gerar. The Lord appeared to Isaac and said, Do not go down to Egypt. Live in the land where I tell you to live. Stay in this land for a while, and I will be with you, and I will bless you. For you and your descendants, for to you and your descendants I will give all these lands, and will confirm the oath I swore to your father Abraham. I will make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, and will give them all these lands, and through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed. Because Abraham obeyed me and did everything I required of him, keeping my commands, my decrees, and my instructions, so Isaac stayed in Gerar. When the men of that place asked him about his wife, he said, She is my sister, because he was afraid to say, She is my wife. He thought, The men of this place might kill me on account of Rebekah, because she is beautiful. When Isaac had been there a long time, Abimelech, king of the Philistines, looked down from his window and saw Isaac caressing his wife Rebekah. So Abimelech summoned Isaac and said, She is really your wife. Why did you say, She is my sister? Isaac answered him, Because I thought I might lose my life on account of her. Then Abimelech said, What is this you have done to us? One of the men might well have slept with your wife, and you would have brought guilt upon us. So Abimelech gave orders to all the people, Anyone who harms this man or his wife shall surely be put to death. All right, so here we are. This feels familiar, so we'll probably have to talk about that. Remember that you can download PDF copies of this Bible study at www.abqnaz.org/alive so that you can follow along with us. And here we go. Number 1 says, What did we talk about in last week's study in Genesis 25? A, the death of Abraham, yes. B, a little bit of family tree stuff for Abraham's children, yes. C, mostly Isaac's sons. That should be sons. I didn't have time to get this to my editor. Jacob and Esau. Mostly Isaac's sons, plural, not possessive. Jacob and Esau. D, we talked about the circumstances of the birth of Isaac's twin boys. We did. So the circumstances were that Rebecca couldn't figure out why they were jostling, why there was jostling within her, and she sought the Lord. And he said that there was two nations within her, and there was sort of prophecy spoken about these two children, and then when they came out, one was red and hairy, and the other one was grabbing his foot, as if to his heel specifically, as if to pull himself ahead. And therefore, they were named based on what happened as they were coming out. Both at some point were renamed because of their actions in their life. Um, and that also was significant, but we only learned a little bit about Esau being renamed to Edom in this text. We talked about Esau selling his birthright, despising his birthright for some soup, and that's true as well. And sort of, if anything, um, I think the way that the last text, we are jumping sort of forward or jumping around in the story a little bit to specific moments in their life rather than sort of telling the whole story of all of their lives. But now we have this moment in Isaac's life where the birthright, the importance of the birthright was clear. And I think last week when we were talking about the birthright and what Esau really gave up, I think Rebecca touched on this, that it was really the blessing of God and the promise of God for their family, and so we're seeing that with Isaac. the significance of that, and I think that becomes clear in the lives of Jacob and Esau later on. Number two, what is happening now according to the beginning of 26:1? It says, now there was a famine in the land. So that's what's happening. There's a famine in the land, and it sort of clarifies, because we have jumped to stories and that we've crossed time periods without telling all the details of what happened in between. It clarifies that this is distinct or separate or besides the previous famine in Abraham's time. So this is a different famine. In between, they have had um, perhaps times of boom and good crops and things like that, but now they are back into a time of famine during Isaac's time. And we see those cyclical patterns in our lives too, don't we? Sometimes ups and downs within our own life, but certainly generation to generation. Number three says, how does Isaac respond according to 26, 1 through 6? And part of this is how Isaac responds, and part of this is what we learn he hears from God about how he should respond. So, A tells us right up front Isaac went to Abimelech, king of the Philistines, in Gerar. So, Isaac was living in their land, or at least Abraham had been living in their land. This had been sort of they had been a constant ally because of the treaty that Abraham made with Abimelech, and now Isaac too is going to Abimelech, although. I think we say it here in a little bit, but not sure if it's the same Abimelech. May have been possible that it could have been through, the same lifetime. Although it's understood that multiple kings of Gerar were named Abimelech, so there were more than one Abimelech. So it's possible that the two Abimelechs that Abraham dealt with in two different sections were actually different. That the one who came to him and made the treaty was already the newly in power son of the previous Abimelech. That's a possibility that's brought out in some of the commentaries, which would explain why that was important to him to establish a treaty at that point. If so, then this may have been the same Abimelech as the second one. If that was the same one that Abraham dealt with, this might have been the son of the one that Abraham dealt with. It's not really clear, and it doesn't really matter that much. They are either way likely the same family of kings, and so there's going to be some information passed along and that sort of thing. Um, B, the Lord appeared to Isaac and said, do not go down to Egypt. Live in the land where I tell you to live. So there is a clear directive from God, do not go down to Egypt. Now, for us, reading this after the time, that may not mean that much, but Egypt, if you look at a map, is the northeasternmost African country, and it's right there where Africa connects to the Middle East. And so, from where Israel is, it would have been the largest and most long-standing, strong nation in the area. In fact, Egypt um, sort of predated some of the empires that rose up and eventually took Israel and Judah captive. But it also outlasted those empires and honestly is still there today. And so, whereas those empires rose and fell and maybe were relegated to smaller areas. Egypt has been a power historically and across a lot of ages. So, um, And we know, of course, that Egypt and Israel had their own, I'll say history, but at Abraham's time, that history is still in the future, and at Isaac's time, that history is still in the future. But God specifically says, "Don't go down to Egypt. Live where I tell you to live." And so we can tell that there is a temptation to go down there. Egypt is at a important spot on trade routes. Egypt is at an important spot for surviving famines because of the rivers that run through it. Egypt, in times of famine, became the place where Israel was tempted to go to get help. As we know, um, when Jacob sent his sons down there to get help, and it turns out Joseph was already there. It was a place where Israel was tempted to go get military help when the armies from the east and from the north came in. Um, and perhaps Egypt would have wanted to help because Israel would have provided a desired buffer between those empires and armies and them. And so there's just a lot of, if you think political and military strategy associated on Egypt's side with why they might want to help Israel over these times, and also perhaps why they weren't to be trusted because um, Israel, if they were strong, could also be a threat to them. So, C says, God said, "Stay in this land for a while, and I will be with you, and I will bless you." So God says that. D, God says, "To you and your descendants I will give all these lands and will confirm the oath I swore to your father Abraham." So it goes back to the promise of God to Abraham, which is significant and important, that God would, and that's repeated here in this text, that God would give them this land, that God would bless his descendants and they would be a blessing. Um, God says, "I will make your descendants as numerous as the stars of the sky." Again, F, Abraham obeyed me and did everything I required of him. So he's saying, remember, Abraham followed my commands. He obeyed me, and then ultimately I blessed him. And the blessing that you have as your birthright is because of my work with Abraham and his obedience to me. The final um, sort of statement, or the final decision, the final answer, if you will, is so Isaac stayed in Gerar, which is what A told us to begin with. So we had known that from the beginning, but it takes us through the why of why did Isaac stay in Gerar, and what were the other options, or what were the other things he might have been tempted to do. So number 4 says, "This seems to be a big deal, and perhaps if we had never studied the text before or other places in the Bible, this would seem just like part of the narrative. Why is all this a big deal?" So I've already started to share some of this. We could just say, "Oh, okay, he stayed in Gerar and didn't go down to Egypt, and no big deal." And I think, by the way, one of the reasons we do Bible study as a group, one of the reasons that I think it's important sort of to have a formal Bible study, if you will, beyond which I hope you're reading at home and studying scripture and allowing God to speak to you at home. But definitely, um, in Acts 6, when the widows were complaining about the distribution of food and things like that, and the apostles said, "We need to devote ourselves to the ministry of the word and to prayer, and so we're going to hand off this ministry of food to others who are filled with the Holy Spirit, who are qualified people." But the whole point was that there would be some who spend their time devoted to the study of the word, so that um, and to prayer, so that when we study these together, that hopefully I, as a pastor, and some of our other pastors and leaders, can present to you some things that you might have missed if you were studying little pieces, because this is our role. This is where our education is. This is where our time is spent. And so we might miss this otherwise, but let me just tell you, if you haven't studied, excuse me, the lights went off. Um, if you haven't studied some of the previous texts that we've been going through, but also other texts in the Bible, if you haven't studied through the Old Testament yet, I've spent more time in my years doing that, and I want to just share with you some things that you might have missed. A says, "Because God said," which is that's an easy answer. That's one we could do without much study. But B says, "Well, God called Abraham out from his home to this place, and has intended all along to give it to them." He said that. That's why Abraham was so clear that the servant should not take Isaac back to his family home in chapter 24. So he said, "Go get a wife, bring her back here for Isaac." And the servant said, "Well, what if she won't come? Should I take Isaac there?" And Abraham says, "No, don't take Isaac there. God called us out. He called us here." So now what God is reiterating to Isaac is, "I have called you here, and I'm going to give you this land. And remember this blessing. And remember that Abraham obeyed me, and as he obeyed me, I blessed him and you because of him. And so now it's your turn to obey me and stay here, despite maybe it feels unsafe. Maybe it feels like you're going to die. Maybe it feels like you and your family and your animals are going to starve to death. But don't go down to Egypt. Um, Trust in me." So C says, actually, "don't go to Egypt for help" is pretty consistent theme through the Old Testament. See Jeremiah 42 and Isaiah 30 through 40. So I'm not going to go and read those right now, but I'll say the one time that we don't hear, I don't know. So um, Jacob's sons sold Joseph into slavery, and he ended up in Egypt, and he ended up a leader in Egypt, and God delivered Israel through Joseph. And we hear that as a positive story about God's intentions in bringing Joseph there. Um, and that the sons were forgiven, and they received deliverance and help from Joseph. Um, but right after that, we hear this ominous phrase that says, "A new Pharaoh came into power who knew not Joseph." So somebody came in that was not aware of what Joseph had done for Egypt, and then by extension through for Israel. But the Egyptians didn't care about that. They cared what Joseph had done for Egypt, and all of a sudden was not predisposed to have a positive image of the Israelites. Instead, they become something to fear because they are multiplying and seem blessed by God, and therefore could seemingly overthrow Egypt. And so they are submitted to slavery instead, and therefore we have this situation where they become captive in Egypt and have to be delivered by Moses. And that is the one time where we don't really hear God saying don't go, because we don't hear the story from Jacob's side. And maybe and we sort of believe that God planned for them to go there, and that was all in God's plan, that Joseph would deliver them. But also it ended up that they were in captivity, and perhaps also part of God's plan for whatever reason. But in many cases, God specifically says, "Don't go to Egypt." And Jeremiah 42 and Isaiah 33, I know that's like 11 chapters, but really I'll say that the first few of those chapters really explain what we're talking about here. And it's at the time where they're about to go into captivity, and God says, don't go to Egypt, trust in me. And we have this interesting story of a king walking out, sort of trying to plan but tempted to go get help from other nations. And God wants to be the deliverer of Israel. And in many cases, he tries to show that he is the only legitimate deliverer of Israel. In fact, Egypt can't be trusted. If you go and get help from Egypt, you will eventually be subject to Egypt. Remember the last time. D. Egypt was a historically strong nation, and Israel always seems tempted to go to them for help. But God's warning is often that they are not a trustworthy ally. And as Israel found out from their many years in slavery at the end of Genesis, the one we go to for help may eventually become our master. And I could just go through multiple examples of how that is true and has been true in our lives. I mean, you're in an emergency, so you go to the payday loan place for help. But it ends up being your master because they charge exorbitant interest rates. You think it's your savior, but it's your master. You're overwhelmed and stressed and frustrated, and you need an escape, so you go to have a beer or whatever, or to smoke some weed or whatever, and then the next thing you know, you have an addiction, and it is your master, the thing that you went to self-medicate. um, people that people that want to say seem to want to help you often tend to hold it over your head afterwards, and they become not a trustworthy helper. But God doesn't do it that way. God is trustworthy. God helps you. God cares about you. God has your best interest at heart. And yes, He'll call you to follow His commands, but that's not holding His help over you. That is for your good. His commands are not arbitrary. His commands are for your good, and He wants what's best for you. And He's the only one that can be trusted to actually want what's best for you, rather than pursuing their own ends and using you as a means to get there. Um, you know, Hopefully, we have godly people around us that don't use us as a means to an end, that love us authentically and put us first. But humans in general can't be trusted for that, and nations are not really good at that, as we've learned in history. E, God wanted to be the provider for His people, and God called on His people to trust in Him rather than going to seemingly helpful people around them, and that's true. Number 5, what do we learn in 26, 7 through 11? A, like father, like son. So now we have this story where Isaac's wife is also beautiful, like Isaac's mother Sarah was beautiful. And so what does he do? He tells everybody around in Abimelech's kingdom, where he is, that Rebecca is his wife. He's worried also, or that Rebecca is his sister. He's worried also that they'll kill him and take his wife because she's beautiful. B, it seems we tend to pass down everything, the good and the bad, to our children. Of course, they have free will in what they do, but what did Abraham model for, and maybe this is subliminal, for his family? That my editor would have helped me with that if I'd had time to get it to her. Commitment to going to or being in the place where God called him. That's the good that he passed down. But also fear about whether God would always protect him there. That's the bad that Abraham apparently passed down to Isaac. So there's this tension between Abraham's faith and trust in God to do what God said, but also his tendency to try to hedge his bets, and because he was really afraid about whether God would really protect him. And what is Isaac doing now? So let me just tell you this, that I know some people that have been seemingly amazing godly leaders in the church, but where they have compromised, perhaps at home, or what their children and family have seen, have been that their faith is not as strong, perhaps, as they show in public. And then therefore what they pass down to their children is different than what is everything that they are. Now our children have their own choices to make, but what we start them out on the path that we model. And that means that they're going to have this tendency to do and be what we have modeled for them. And we need to be very careful. I struggle with so many pastors whose children have not always been faithful to God, and it is it's hard because I know very godly people that whose children chose their own path and didn't choose what was modeled. And so I can't blanket say this is the diagnosis, this is what happened. But I will tell you that I do know some people who I know what they modeled in public, and I know what they sacrificed and the faith that they expressed. But I also know that where their priorities were was sometimes divided. And because it was, and when it was, their children saw that perhaps better than anybody else. And therefore, so if you're let me just tell you, if you're a faithful, godly person in church, but at home you show something different, then I guarantee your children will learn to look like faithful, godly people at church, but they will at home be something different because that's what they have learned from you. If you make godly decisions at home, and explain to them why you're making the choices that you are and model making that kind of choice in your family life as well as, because people from outside can criticize and they can think all sorts of things about our choices. But when we're following God with those choices and we're confident that God is in them, and then we explain that to our kids, and that's what we're modeling, they're going to start out with a much better chance at living a life obedient to and blessed by God. And so we got to be careful. So number 6 says, what are you passing on to your children or to those around you? Maybe your children are grown, maybe you don't have children, but what are you passing on to the people around you that are watching your every move? They're watching what you're doing and how you're making your decisions. This is important. This is significant. And so we're gonna stop there and leave with that thought.